Hi, this is Michael Chertuti with Strala, and I'm excited to share with you today in this webinar or podcast the results from our benchmark survey that we did regarding measurement, attribution, tracking, how marketers in general are measuring the success of their marketing efforts, their campaigns, and the like. So let's get into this. We surveyed over 100 marketers, and we got lots of different responses from those in the enterprise, those in mid-sized companies, those that are B2B marketing, doing B2C marketing. And so this is a really good representation of the state of the market in general. And we found some really interesting things within this that we want to share with you. In a previous webinar, we talked about attribution, we talked about media mix modeling, we talked about the best models to be using. And this one we're going to go a little bit deeper into the why of measurement and the how of measurement in terms of how marketers are currently attempting to do this. So right off the bat, one of the things that we see is that only 11% of marketers are very confident in their abilities to rely on their current measurement and attribution models and the accuracy of their models. And if we look a little bit more deeply about the reasons behind that, what we see are two big foundational issues. Number one is marketers in general are still using a last touch or a last click model as opposed to the more sophisticated models. Another reason is probably even a more important issue is the data. And because we as marketers are collecting data from so many different silos and data schemas across different channels, and we're trying to bring all this data together, and what's happening is we're still measuring a lot of these channels in isolation. So we see that 46% of marketers are still measuring at the individual channel level. And if we expand that out a little bit, we still see that even though they may not be measuring at the individual channel level, they still may be grouping some of their paid channels together, like their digital paid search and display and video. And so that's contributing to this problem, is having all of these disparate data silos. So we're going to go a little bit more deeper into this. Now, marketers today, when they talk about measuring performance and measuring marketing performance, there are really a few things that we are trying to achieve as marketers. So number one, we are still trying to chase, to a degree, that elusive efficiency and ROI metric. And so it's really important for us to know for every dollar we invest in marketing, whether that's in content production or in paid media channels, what is our return on investment? And even our teams. And so the second thing that we're trying to measure is the growth. How many customers are we bringing on board? How many inquiries are we generating? How many of those inquiries are turning into closed opportunities if we're a B2B business? And so we're trying to measure the growth of our efforts and the growth of our business. Marketing over the last few years has really been catapulted into a driver's seat in driving growth. And again, we've seen this in the titles that are showing up within the marketing organization, many taking on growth titles as well. When we look at the third thing that we're looking at, we're still trying to measure lifetime value. That's more of an elusive metric, and it's because you have to take into consideration proxy metrics over a long period of time of the value of each individual customer. And then last but not least, we are still attempting to measure brand, and through our awareness and our reach studies, which have been around for a long time. And so if you're doing lots of marketing and you've got good studies in market, you're able to accomplish this. But it's really interesting and important to note that overall we're chasing ROI, we're chasing efficiency, followed very closely by growth. When we start to look at all of the different channels that we are, as marketers, are using, we see that the digital channels has really come into their own over the last 10 years. It really wasn't like that, 15 years ago even, when digital was really a nascent notion. And so when we surveyed marketers, we asked them, how would you prioritize these channels that you're using in terms of what are most effective in driving results? And not surprisingly, we see email at the top. It's an easy way to engage, to be very specific, to be very customized, be very personalized within our messaging. And then that's closely followed by things like paid social, organic social, website display, paid search, SEO, video. And then we start to get to more into those other traditional channels like print, events, filled in retail, and then followed by TV and radio. If you're a big leading national advertiser, obviously these are going to be more at the forefront for you if you've got a big consumer play. And so anyway, it's really interesting as we think about these different channels that we have and all of the different publishers that these channels represent. If we're talking about search marketing or paid search marketing, we're really looking at 3 or 4 different search engines. If we're talking about display, we could be using 10, 20, 30 different networks. If we're talking about affiliates, you could have hundreds of affiliates that are driving sales for you. And then when we start thinking about content that is represented within each of these channels, it gets even much more troublesome. So we're going to talk a little bit about that within the survey results. If we take a little bit of a back step and we look at, again, that notion that the majority of marketers are still using a last touch or last click attribution model, what we see is we have lots of data from all these siloed channels feeding these attribution models, and we're really still not being extremely sophisticated with all of the touch points. As an industry, we know that on average, there are about 13 different touches preceding a conversion. And so we're still just giving credit to that last click now, or that last touch. If you're using a more sophisticated model, a heuristic model that's taking into consideration all of the touches like a linear or a time decay model, then we're moving into a track where we're going to be able to give credit to more of those different channels. And then last but not least, are the mathematically driven or the algorithmic models where we're letting the data inform us as to what's the most effective and least effective in terms of where we should be investing our dollars across content and marketing channels, if you will. So let's get into some of the tool aspect of this and some of the different methodologies. The majority of marketers are still using web analytics as the primary measurement tool for things like attribution. And one of the challenges with this is that web analytics is a great tool for measuring the effectiveness of your website, but the way that the web analytics data schemas have been orchestrated and created is that they were really not built for the ability to handle touches digitally, but also more importantly, those offline touches as well. And so that's something to consider when we're thinking about these different touch points, especially if we're trying to integrate conversions from systems like a CRM system or a point of sale system as well. It gets a little bit more troublesome. Also, these data schemas really aren't built to not be overriding each other, and so we have to think about that, and we see that all the time. 57% of marketers out there are still trying to consolidate. If they're not just using web analytics, they're consolidating all of those channels, all of those publishers, all those data sets into a data warehouse, and then they're trying to extract the ROI and insights. And sometimes we refer to this as co-locating their data to try and get insights out of it. It's troublesome, it's challenging, but that's how a lot of marketers are still trying to do this. Again, 46% of marketers are still measuring channels in isolation, and only 13% are using a third-party attribution solution that's not web analytics. And there's been some really good attribution solutions on the marketplace that have come about in the last 10 years. Interestingly, a lot of them are still focused on channel measurement, which is still a good area because now you're able to take into consideration multiple touches using something much more sophisticated. But we need to start talking about content and attribution of the buyer journey, not just in terms of a channel. So let's look at the survey results and see what it tells us. When we're thinking about the different types of models that are being used, really it comes into 2 primary areas. We're talking about attribution models, or we're talking about, on the other hand, marketing mix or media mix models. Now, with media mix models and marketing mix models, they've been around for several decades. That's where we're looking at not associating the touch points to an individual profile, whether it's anonymous or a known profile. In an attribution model, that's where we're trying to associate these touch points to a known profile. So in our previous webinar, we talked about the pros and cons of these different attribution models versus the media or the marketing mix models. Take a look at that if you want to learn more about that, and when is it appropriate to look at the usage of either of these models and when you should be looking at using them both in conjunction. So let's think a little bit more about some of the elements around what goes into measurement. And we're going to be talking next about how marketers are tracking their efforts. And we've also done another webinar where we've talked a little bit about this notion of touch point measurement and tracking, and refer to this one where we're talking about what's going to happen if cookies go away. What's going to happen if, especially third-party cookies go away? Is the world going to end, and am I going to lose my ability to measure? And the answer is absolutely not. And so check out that webinar and that podcast when we're talking about privacy and legislation. And just to give a little bit of a footnote to that, we're really talking about third-party data going away and third-party cookies. That's where the legislation is really focused. A lot of the first-party notions, we're still going to be able to measure the impact and the interaction directly with our customers as a brand. So that's going to be really important. When we think about some of the pitfalls associated with measuring marketing attribution and getting the data that we need, we find a few things. So this is the list of areas that marketers responded to this question, and they basically said, what's inhibiting us from being successful in our measurement? And the top thing is siloed data across multiple channels, followed very closely by inconsistent tracking across channels. Interestingly, third is the insufficient attribution models in the survey result. We've seen other surveys that we've done where the attribution models were last on the list, and it was all about the data feeding bad attribution models. So we're still seeing that marketers are using these insufficient attribution models. And then we see incomplete data, insufficient staff to aggregate and manage the data, followed by inconsistent data standards. Now it's really interesting because we actually see some marketers who, if they're addressing the consistent tracking issue, it actually alleviates some of the other challenges associated with this. But it's interesting that marketers still are citing that some of these top challenges are related to the data across the channels, co-locating it, having inconsistent data standards, and the like. And so these are key areas that are contributing to this measurement dilemma, in addition to the models. When we think about another element of getting beyond the channel, or the medium, if you will, a lot of marketers are still finding challenges in being able to track the effectiveness and the efficiency across their content. And when we start thinking about this, marketers, we know they've got pretty dialed the ability, to a degree, to measure their medium or their channel, their source, their publisher. But what really is becoming a pitfall for marketers is they know that content is king, and being able to measure the effectiveness in a very standardized, consistent way within those channels or across those channels, these content attributes or dimensions, it's really troublesome. So we see third on the list is it's really challenging to track messaging. And it's also challenging to track things like the content media. Was it an image or print or video? Also, what are the campaign themes, which is closely related to messaging? And so marketers are struggling with trying to track and attribute the content effectiveness into their overall marketing mix. When we look at peeling back this a little bit more, when we start to think about why is this a challenge, it's because what we find in this next question is that attempting to track all the campaign activities is a fairly manual process. We see that marketers are trying to create tracking codes, UTM parameters. They're trying to edit them. They're trying to quickly audit them. They're trying to search for tracking codes. They're trying to create custom tracking code views. And it's becoming really challenging because they're really relegated to using homegrown systems and spreadsheets. And so we see that this is a challenge for marketers. Next, what we see is that still marketers, 81% of them are using a UTM methodology to track campaigns. There's nothing necessarily or inherently wrong with UTM parameters. The challenge, though, is that when we talk about the 5 key UTM parameters that have been around for the last 20 years, which, if you think about UTM, Urchin tracking, which was acquired by Google Analytics and became Google Analytics, we're still using that methodology from a dimension and an attribute perspective. And we think about source, we think about medium, we think about content, we think about keyword. It kind of started out with keywords. And so when we try and track all these different dimensions around content, we're not really thinking more expansively around messaging and buyer stage and journey stage and promotions and other elements critical to the content elements. And so as a result, we're using these UTM methodologies, and we think there's a direct relationship and correlation in the inability to track their content in an effective way. And so other companies, again, we see that the next area is that they're building their own homegrown unique tracking ID, source ID, campaign ID systems, and then there are others. And so anyway, when we think about unique IDs and UTMs, this is a contributing factor to possibly that area where we could be tracking and getting much more intelligence in our content areas in addition to our channels. Also, as we mentioned as well, over 60% of marketers are still using spreadsheets, some kind of spreadsheet in the cloud or a Google Doc or something like that in terms of tracking their parameters, their URLs, their tracking codes for digital. And that is a challenge because there's a poor ability for us to structure really good governance around that. Other companies, again, are using a tracking code generator. And then you've got relying on the native third-party tracking from all of the different ad networks and marketing technologies that we're using, such as from Google AdWords or DoubleClick or Yahoo, or if we're using an email system, we're relying on those third-party IDs, and then we try and bring all the data together, which is what we see from multiple channels, and then we're trying to extract insights out of that, and that, I think, is contributing to the challenge as well. Something that's going to be, I think, going to be interesting as well is when we think about how people are actually getting their IDs or their tracking codes into their, places where they're placing their media, whether that's a link or something else. 70+% of marketers are doing a copy and paste version where they're copying their UTM parameters or their ID, putting it into a link. They're using spreadsheets, a URL shortener, and some level of in-house automation. But again, we see it's a very manual process, and I think it's contributing from the research to these challenges and these pitfalls that are plaguing the industry in general. When we think about the ability to track and measure our conversions, we're also seeing that this is a very manual process. And we see that marketers are trying to create and manage custom conversion goals. They're trying to track external campaigns versus their internal campaigns, and they end up overriding each other. It's challenging to import and export the APIs or CSV files and bulk uploads. And it's just really hard to integrate these IDs in an automated way, and they're doing this very manually. And so as a result of that, it's challenging for us as marketers to try and easily get these IDs, because we know they're critical for us to give credit to that content or those channels, and it's a very manual process. Next, what we're looking at is this ability to create governance and URLs. And only 10% of marketers are easily able to create and manage governance and consistency. And when we think about governance, we're thinking about things like, do I have a standardized pick list for my marketing taxonomy of different attributes or classifications? Can I update these metadata values? Can I retroactively update them if the name of the value changes? How do I create and organize my marketing taxonomy? How do I make sure that everybody's using the right parameters, the right fields, the right values? And then how do I make sure that they're getting properly digitally into the URLs, or if non-digitally, if we're associating them with events and other things, that they're getting uploaded correctly? So there's a governance piece here that's really challenging that creates inconsistency in our data sets. Also, 95% of marketers, what we see is they need to be able to easily validate URLs, but only 18% are able to do so. We see this all the time showing up in the data where marketers are pushing out a link with an ID in it or UTM parameters, and then afterwards they find out that that URL is not working. And again, all of these things are contributing to insufficient data or incomplete data that's feeding our models. And so, these we're calling out in this survey, and we're finding that marketers are finding challenges with this ability to define and organize, validate the URLs. Lastly, I think the key here is summing up, if we want to be investing and knowing where to invest our next incremental dollar of whether it's for media or for content, we need good, clean data. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be standardized. And so it's really interesting when we look through the research of what's contributing to the bad data, feeding possibly insufficient or unsophisticated models. That's really where we should be focusing our efforts. Also, because this webinar or this podcast corresponds with the data of the report, please download the report, and it's available right here for you, and you can see the full report and assess the areas where marketers are being challenged with, and you can benchmark yourself against the results from this survey data. And with that, we'll sign off and hopefully see you next time at our next podcast or webinar. Thank you.